How's it going? And welcome to No Fun Allowed. And today we are going to be talking about horror in Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frostmaiden. This video is going to be both for DMs and players, at least for the first half anyway. In the second half, we'll be diving into certain aspects of this module. But first, I want to go ahead and discuss horror in our games, and specifically Icewind Dale. So this is it for what covers horror in this module. Horror in the far north. Parts of this adventure play out like scenes of a horror movie. As the DM, you need to handle this horror responsibly. Although the events of the adventure should make the characters feel stressed and anxious, your players should be relaxed and having fun. Before running the adventure, have a candid out-of-game conversation with your players about hard and soft limits on what topics can be broached in-game. Your players might have phobias and triggers you might not be aware of. Any topic or theme that makes a player feel unsafe should be avoided. If a topic or theme makes one or more players nervous, but they give you consent to include it in-game, incorporate it with care. Be ready to move away from such topics and themes quickly, however. And that's it. That's pretty much all the information we get. And from that information, we can glean a decent amount of information. So let's go ahead and start covering all of that, shall we? The first thing that I want to go over is consent. So it is now more standard practice that most gaming groups have a session 0 where you sit down and talk about the game, you talk about the themes that you want to see in it, the rules that we have in play, and how we're going to build our characters and all that. But consent is something that doesn't always get put on the table because some people don't want to approach that matter. You might be familiar with this group and may not need to include it, or maybe you just don't think to include it because you don't want to have to deal with that. Consent is a big deal and it should be discussed. Mind you, it doesn't have to be discussed in front of everybody. It can just be the player going to the DM and they just have one little sidetrack conversation, or maybe even slip in their DMs with some messages because they don't even want to speak about it out loud. But there should be limits on how far you can go when you are running your game. This is a group game we're playing, and you need to consider the group as a whole, not just as your own individual, whether you are a player or whether you are a DM. The second thing I want to discuss here is the buy-in of horror. So as a DM, you can go ahead and paint this elaborate picture that makes it sound scary, but then you could just have players sit there and tell a dick joke and everyone starts laughing at the table. In which case, it defeats the point of playing a horror game. You need to sit there as a group and decide if you're going to play in a horror game, what is the buy-in? Are you going to roleplay out what your character is saying? Are you going to be acting outside of your character's knowledge? Or are you just going to be telling some jokes along the side and not diving into that aspect of horror? Horror means a lot of things to a lot of different people here, and the buy-in is the biggest part of horror. If you're watching a horror movie but you're just sitting there on your phone the entire time and not paying attention, you're not really going to be jumping when that big monster appears on screen for the first time. But if you sit there and truly immerse yourself into it and you don't allow outside distractions, then you're going to buy into it a lot more. And that buy-in is one of the biggest aspects of horror, specifically in fantasy role-playing games. Are you going to be playing characters that are awesome, badass heroes that can conquer anything, in which case they're not scared of anything? Or are your players going to be playing people that do get scared and do get frightened of terrifying situations? The third thing I want to go over here is horror. So what is horror? As I just mentioned, horror means so many different things to so many different people. What you might find scary, another person might not, and vice versa. So you do have to sit down with the table and discuss what is horror and what isn't. Do you think that people getting ripped apart is scary? Or do you think that people getting hit by a fireball and having their skin melted off isn't that big of a deal? It really depends on the person, and there is no simple solution to it. You do have to sit down and discuss with everyone here, what is horror? Do you want horror to be a psychological aspect of the constant gnawing and fear and the isolation? Or do you want horror to be more physical and more in your face? There are different types of horror, and whatever theme you decide to fall upon, you need to explore right from the get-go, because if you start going into a certain motion of trying to portray horror and it's just not sticking, then what's the point? And lastly, on the player side of things, I want to go over this sentence. Your players should be relaxed and having fun. What is relaxed and having fun mean? Obviously, having fun is subjective, Maybe you don't want to be relaxed when you're playing this game. Maybe you want to be on the edge of your seat. Maybe you want to be scared. Maybe you want to be horrified. Maybe you want to feel stressed. Maybe you want to feel anxious. Maybe you want to feel certain things that you normally don't feel, because at least if you're doing it in a group, you're doing it in a safe space, in which case that's okay. But we are all human beings. We all feel different types of ways. We all relax in different ways. We all have fun in different ways. So once again, just talk to everyone and discover what is fun for you and your group. And it's there you're going to discover what all you like. And maybe you'll discover that maybe this game just isn't for you. Or maybe just specifically horror isn't for you. Maybe that group in particular isn't for you. You will discover these things if you just go ahead and talk to everyone. That is going to do it for the player side of things in regards of horror in Icewind Dale Rime of the Frostmaiden. So now I'll be covering the DM side of horror in this module. So of course there is going to be spoilers that we're going to be talking about, so players do not watch any further. Alrighty, now that the players are gone, let's go ahead and dive into horror. Alrighty DMs, let's go ahead and get started. So I'll be covering 3 things in this section here. Why, how, and where. The first off is why horror. Why run horror in this module? I can read this module and I could infer from the text that this is a high-stakes roaring adventure, pulp action style. Your players are going up against the elements and saving the day, and they're big damned heroes and they're totally awesome and nothing gets in their way, and it can read just like that. But maybe you don't want to read it like that. Maybe you want to read it like your players are struggling every day to survive. Your players are going up against monsters and men that are far more terrifying than anything else. And maybe you want to go ahead and show that off in the guise of horror. So why do it? Well, the pretty simple answer is that horror is a great way to motivate people. It can motivate people to step above and beyond their comfort zones, whether that be the player or the character. But hopefully the character, because hopefully we don't have players in an uncomfortable situation. Fear and horror is what is going to drive your players to save the day. They are going to go up against the unknown. They are going to go up against the terrible elements that are floating around here. They will be seeing things they've never seen before. They'll be doing things they've never done before. And they will have to overcome the horrors and the monstrosities that lie around here. But of course, there's something really big to consider is 5th edition natively doesn't do horror well, I've found, because you are big damned heroes. On paper, 5th edition characters are badasses. They wield a whole bunch of magics. They're harder to kill. They can do a lot of things that most people cannot do. So why horror in 5th edition? Well, I've found that the best way to induce horror in 5th edition is by introducing house rules, homebrew rules, or some stuff from the DMG, such as maybe you can bring in the honor and sanity scores. Maybe you can go ahead and induce long-term, short-term, and indefinite madness far more often in your games. Maybe you induce the lingering injuries table, and maybe you go ahead and sit down and induce a whole bunch of other house rules as well. Now listen, I think I'm a pretty strong guy. I think I would be able to handle my own in most situations. But I promise you, if I'm in the middle of a dark tunnel and all of a sudden tentacles wrap around me and I look up and I see a floating brain with a beak, I'm gonna be freaking out. But the thing is that more often than not, we don't think about that human aspect of the game. We like to think that we're awesome heroes, and the players are gonna immediately say, alright, I'm getting captured, what do I do? And they start looking at their character sheet and they start trying to figure out the answers, whether they be casting the spell or they roll an athletics check to try and get released. Your players typically don't think about the horror aspect of it. You need to seriously sit down and decide, am I going to allow myself to think like the character? Am I going to be playing a character that is willing to dive into this mysterious unknown? So why do we do horror? Well, it's because of situations like this. It's because we want to feel something that we don't regularly feel. We typically don't have to worry about dinosaurs popping out of lakes in the middle of a dark frozen tundra, and we don't have to worry about all these elements. We typically live happy lives and we'd go ahead and have some escapism. That is why we do horror. We want to feel like we normally don't feel. So now that you've sat down and questioned yourself, why do you want to do horror, and you finally conclude that you want to do it, then the second question is, how do we do horror? Of course, horror means a lot of different things. It could be, of course, more physical, or it could be more mental. Are your players dealing with the body horror of this campaign, where they're seeing people with frozen off limbs and they're seeing monstrosities and evil monsters in the shadows? Or are they dealing with a more psychological aspect of horror, where they are constantly going out into the middle of nowhere, where the bitter cold is making them numb, where they are being affected in the brain by alien creatures, and thus they are permanently scarred? Is that the kind of horror you want? How do we go about doing that? Well, the easiest solution is to play into the darkness. Human beings have spent their entire lives trying to build up light because they fear the darkness. Play up into that. This module is the perfect way to go ahead and showcase how there is little light in this world. Your players are stepping out into darkness, and there is no sun, and there will never be sun because they just don't get to see it. If you play up the fact that your players can't see more than 60 feet in any direction at any given time, that's terrifying. There could be something right there looming on the edge. Your players could hear a howl on the wind. Your players could see a pair of eyes just for a brief moment, and then they rush back into the darkness. There is so many great ways you can deal with darkness, and that is terrifying. So yeah, those people that have dark vision, they can see a little bit better than most people, but of course they can't see perfectly. Dark vision is not perfect, it just lets you see a little bit more than most people can. As stated, it gives you disadvantage on perception checks, and that's it. It just lets you see a little bit better. But of course, what about the people that don't have dark vision? They're reliant on either magic or on torches. If they're using torches, then hey, that's a big deal, because if they have a torch, then it's a pretty easy sell to go ahead and say that the torch gets snuffed out in a blustering cold. And hey, if they're using magic, such as the light cantrip, good news, they can go ahead and see around in any direction. Bad news, they're a shining beacon to all the monsters that are waiting out there. Imagine that, you're just walking out there in a frozen tundra and you need to see in front of you because you know you'll trip or you'll fall or you'll sink into something, so you need to see in front of you. But if you cast that light cantrip on yourself, congratulations, you're announcing yourself to the world. Everybody would be able to see you from a very large distance, but you wouldn't be able to see them. That looming aspect, the fear of the unknown, not knowing what is just beyond your reach and your vision, that is terrifying. That is true horror. Another great aspect of horror we can show off is the fact that people are being driven to insanity. People are killing each other. Of course, this example is a red wizard who totally deserved it, but I'm more talking about the sacrifices to O'Reilly. Civilized towns that were regularly brothers in arms, side by side, going up against the elements to survive and thrive, are now throwing each other under the bus to sacrifice to O'Reilly. And that's a big deal. People are starving because they cannot catch fish. People are going cold because they are offering up their warmth. And most important of all, people are losing friends and loved ones. These sacrifices to O'Reilly have been going on for a bit of time, and they will continue to go on. At some point, everybody is going to lose someone that they know. And that is horrific, knowing that you're looking around and questioning, who's next? Did someone rig that election? Oh hey, maybe if I get elected, I'll go ahead and skip out of town. But if they skip out of town, that's a long trek to another location along the road in the darkness. Who knows what's lying out there? But of course, horror doesn't have to lie in the unknown and what resides in town. It can also be about going up against the elements. It could be going up against what is right there in front of you. Imagine you spend hours upon hours trudging through the snow, climbing a mountain. Then you look up and you see a horrific beast that is going to tear you limb from limb. And how do you know it's going to tear you limb from limb? Because you've already seen this example. You see the horrific nature of these creatures, and you see what happens when you cross them. You come across bodies strewn across the field that have been torn and decapitated. They have been ripped asunder, and you know that if you mess up, that is going to be you next. Horror is not just the unknown. Horror is knowing exactly what you're getting in for and somehow stepping up the courage to step forward. Now, of course, with this example, your players are going up against a Yeti. But what if your players regularly go up against Yetis and they regularly beat them? They lose that horror nature on them because they become familiar. In which case, if you want to go ahead and throw similar tropes against them, you are going to have to shake things up a bit. Instead of your players just going up against Yetis out there in the middle of a tundra, they instead find a bunch of Yetis that are literally tearing people limb from limb. And they come across a scene where people are screaming out in agony and horror as they are snuffed out. Or in fact, it could be this scene right here where a Yeti decides to go ahead and grab one of the adventurers and throw them off the cliff. Seeing something and not being able to do anything about it is horrific. So how do you horror? Do you play up into the mysterious? Do you play up into the known? Do you play up into the horrific nature of the world that your players find themselves in? There is a lot of ways to introduce horror into your campaign, and you need to decide how many factors of horror there are in it. And lastly, here on this list, we need to go over where is the horror. Well, that's pretty simple. The horror is everywhere. The horror follows them. The horror is wherever they go. The horror is constantly in their sight. Take, for example, the quest that they can get pretty early on, the Cauldron Caves. They come across a horrific scene. They find a hag who is eating people, and I mean, just look at this art right here. That right there is horrific. You show your players this, and they're going to freak out. They're going to see that head in the corner. They're going to see these intestines that are getting drawn up. Pretty gross stuff. Your players can find horror in the towns. Look at this. Your players find a statue of a devil and also a woman tied to it. That's horrific, and especially once she shows her true guise in the fact that she is a ghost. She's going to literally scare people to death. She has that capability. She can age people so much with that horrific gaze that they flat out die. But we also need to consider the fact that sometimes where the horror is could be a good location, but maybe you don't like the theme. I see this come up a lot, that people don't like the It Ascendant. That might be because they don't like sci-fi in their fantasy. That might be because they don't like these guys. The Gnome Ceramorphs are individuals that on paper are written as goofy and weird, but you can play them up to such a horrific degree. You can show off the fact that these people are stitching other humanoid and other beings together. You can show off the fact that they are consuming brains. You can show off the fact that if they don't get what they want, they are going to go on a consumption spree. They will head to the next town and start consuming and liquefying everybody's brains. That's pretty scary to me. And of course, we can't forget that one of the major locations where your players can find horror is in the 10 towns. There is a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. There's a murderer on the loose who is killing people. There are people getting elected to be sacrificed to O'Reilly. And for this example right here, we have the Chartland Dragon is literally turning people against other people. Look at that. That could be a kid armed with a hand axe. How terrifying would that be? Seeing kids arm themselves with weaponry and start hacking away at other people. And of course, the people are going to have to defend themselves. You're going to see people going up against other people, and that sucks. And during the destruction of the 10 towns, people are going to obviously take advantage of the situation. You're going to see thugs beating up on old women. You're going to see people backstabbing anybody they can. You're going to see the Duergar trying to assassinate political leaders. That is once again terrifying. The fear of the unknown. The Duergar that are invisible, waiting just for the right moment to strike when they can. The people are waiting to strike when they can. And of course, the people that have been turned by the Chartland Dragon are just simply going to wreak havoc. So where can we find horror in this module? Well, you can find it from the very first page to the very last one. There is a lot to this adventure, and it really comes down to the frequency of how often you want horror. Do you want it in every minute of every hour of every session that you run of this campaign? Or do you want to ease up on the gas a little bit? Maybe you have some sessions be horror-fueled, but then another couple of sessions where your players can go ahead and relax a bit, and they don't have to worry about the terrifyingness of this location. Maybe your players earn that respite, and you go ahead and allow it to happen. Or maybe you go ahead and just use that to your advantage. When the players least suspect it, that is when the true horror strikes. Your players are sitting back in town, and lo and behold, that favorite NPC they know and love got elected for the sacrifice to O'Reilly. That NPC fisherman that they care so much about, oh, they got kidnapped by gnolls, and you have to go ahead and deal with that. Your players think they're safe in town, but they are hearing rumors that there is a giant that is riding a mammoth that is encircling the town and challenging anybody that makes their way out of it. It's already killed 10 people, and your players could be next. However we want to place horror in our campaign, it is important to consider how often it is, where it is, and what is the outcome of it. If you're going to have jump scares just for jump scare's sake, then yeah, that can work. But don't do it too often. It starts losing its weight. It starts not becoming as impactful as it was. So when you have different horror themes in your campaign, you do need to shake it up a bit. You can't make it obvious that they know what's going to be around the corner. If they are trudging around in the dark field tundras, they can't know what is always about to jump them. They will find out, and it won't be horror anymore. It'll just be cliche. Go ahead and tell me, how do you plan on running horror in this module? I want to know, because a lot of people are going to take a lot of different approaches to this, and there isn't really a right answer. There is a wrong answer, however. If you introduce horror that is unsettling for your players, then that's usually a no-no. But of course, if you are playing with players that you know well enough, and you of course talk about these things, it really shouldn't be that big of an issue. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to all my amazing patrons up here. You guys are absolutely awesome. Thank you so very much. I wanted to talk about horror because I think horror is an interesting aspect to a lot of role-playing games, but I feel like a lot of times it usually gets skipped. This module was touted as being horror-filled, and you know, most people aren't really picking up on that horror. And that may be because people aren't necessarily reading between the lines, or maybe that's because they just don't want to see it. But there's always some way you can fill this module full of horror. It really just comes down to how much you're willing to work for it. That is going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and I cannot wait to see you all in the next one.